Hello, this is Dr. Eric Bricker, and thank you for watching AHealthcareZ. Today's topic is how to spot a bad healthcare boss. Now, many of you have probably had wonderful bosses, and some of you have had bad bosses. I know I've had wonderful bosses and bad bosses in healthcare, and so I thought it would be important for us to understand how to differentiate between the two. Now, what it really comes down to, in my opinion, is actually Plato's Philosopher King, right? So I'm a big believer that there's really nothing new in the universe, right? Most stuff has already happened, okay? And so Plato in ancient Greece actually had a concept for the ideal king. And by king, it's really like not only the ruler of a nation, but it could be the ruler of an organization, it could be the ruler of a department, it could be the ruler of just a small group of people. In other words, a leader. And Plato said that that leader needed to be a philosopher. And by that, he meant that that leader needed to be curious and kind and benevolent and just and altruistic. Okay, so probably the epitome of the philosopher king or queen in healthcare was really Florence Nightingale, who I'm sure many of you know the story of her. So she was British, but she actually is the mother of sort of modern nursing, where she went from Britain to all the way over to like where the Crimean War was happening between Great Britain and Russia, and all the British troops who had gotten injured were in these horrible hospitals that were gross and disgusting and filled with rodents and filth, and she cleaned it up, and she organized the supplies, and she organized the staff, and she trained the staff. Shoot, she's like the mother of hospital administration in addition to the mother of nursing, and she like totally cleaned this place up, and as a result, the mortality rate in these hospitals plummeted, and she was a hero in her own time. And she really displayed all of the characteristics of the curiosity, the kindness, benevolence, the justice, and the altruism. In other words, what is this philosopher king that Plato was talking about? It was someone who's not selfish. Okay, so really, how to spot a bad boss in healthcare? This is really an exercise in how to avoid selfish leaders. So what I've done here is I've created a matrix here of sort of 6 ways that you can spot a selfish leader, and then how you can spot that either in your potential immediate boss. In other words, you're interviewing a position and this person is potentially going to be your boss, or you're already in a position and this person is your boss. But not only your immediate boss, but what about all the other leaders in the organization? What about the CEO and the executive team and the directors and all the other levels of leadership within an organization? How can you spot selfishness in the leadership of other levels of the organization as well? So let's go through this list of 6. Number 1, they don't listen. Okay, how can you tell if a boss doesn't listen? Well, they tend to be very one-sided conversations. In other words, the other person is doing a lot of the talking, and they're not asking a lot of questions of you, and you're not doing a lot of talking. Okay, that is an immediate like red flag for selfishness. Okay, now within an organization, organizational non-listening is the equivalent of being like non-responsive. Okay, well, how can you tell that an organization is non-responsive? Well, if they don't meet like very basic needs of the employees, then you can really tell that they're not responsive. What are some examples of that? Okay, if the space is cramped, like, believe me, when I initially had a job out of college, I would work in these incredibly cramped, the laptop had sort of just been invented, so they gave us laptops and they just like crammed us into these like essentially like closets, okay? So they just didn't give us enough space. Okay, if the working conditions are dirty, I would work in these resident rooms in the hospital that were filthy. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, here I am working 30, 36-hour shifts, and you can't even like have the resident room like clean? Okay. And then also like, just like, is it poorly lit? Like I've worked in like situations where, well, this lighting is terrible. Like we have no windows and the lights are super dim. Like if I need to work, like at least give me some light to work in. Okay, so if you're going to interview at a place, just like look at the working conditions. Look where people are working. Is it cramped? Is it dirty? Is it poorly lit? Those are total red flags for an organization that doesn't listen. Okay, next up, they don't reciprocate. Okay, so at the individual boss level, a way that you can tell this is that when you're talking with your boss, or if you're interviewing for a job, have a lot of enthusiasm. And if they don't have a lot of enthusiasm back, well then, by definition, they're not reciprocating your enthusiasm. So that's a really good test. It's just to be really enthusiastic and just to see if they can reciprocate that, because it takes effort and energy, and it takes a lack of selfishness to actually be enthusiastic. Because guess what? Most people, when they're enthusiastic, they don't actually feel like being enthusiastic, okay? Enthusiasm isn't a feeling, enthusiasm is a choice, okay? So is your boss, or potential boss, are they choosing to be enthusiastic or are they not? Okay, next up. How can you tell at the organizational level? Well, so many people now. We've got these Zoom meetings, and you're virtual working from home, et cetera, et cetera. So you turn your camera on, and nobody else turns their camera on. So you can tell that other people within the organization aren't reciprocating because they're not turning their own camera on. And maybe they're like, well, I don't have a good background, or I didn't clean my desk. Okay, well then fix your background and clean your desk. Okay, so reciprocate what the other person is doing when they're turning on their camera. I mean, they've put on decent clothes, they've shaven, they've got a decent background and cleaned up their desk. So if they've done that, well then you should reciprocate and do that too. And if you don't, well then that's obviously a red flag for selfishness. Okay, next up, not acknowledging the other side. So of course you're gonna have differences of points of view in any workplace. It's healthy and normal. Okay, so if your boss gets defensive and argumentative about that, okay? So Stephen Covey talks about it as it's not my way, it's not your way, it's the third way. Okay, so that's really what you should expect your boss to actually try to creatively problem solve with you to if it's not going to be your way and it's not going to be his or her way, then you try to think of a creative third way to do that. But if they become defensive and argumentative about their particular position, well, that's obviously a sign of selfishness. Okay, next up, at the organizational level, not acknowledging the other side manifests itself as blame. The organization blames, or you see quotes from the CEO and they blame. And there is a perfect example of this where there is a potential strike between doctors in Oregon and hospitals. And one of the hospital CEOs was completely blaming the union for the situation and publicly stating that. And so, he might feel that personally, but just to openly state the blame is a clear sign of selfishness on the part of that person. I mean, it's anytime you point your finger at somebody else, you got three fingers pointing back at yourself, right? So anytime there's blame, that's kind of like your cue for selfishness, okay? Or insurance companies are constantly blaming doctors and hospitals. Doctors and hospitals are constantly blaming insurance companies. They're both constantly blaming the government and vice versa. Anytime because blame is so disempowering. Blame is basically saying, the problem isn't me, it's you. When at the end of the day, what is in your control is obviously you, and there's obviously things that you can do to improve the situation, which might include some completely different plan that might not even involve the other party, okay? So just know that anytime you see an organization that has statements of blame, that's also a red warning sign for selfishness. Okay, next up. When they break their own rules, okay? Now, what's an example of an immediate boss breaking their own rules? Well, in the hospital, the classic one here is something that's called turfing. And turfing is when a doctor, or it might be for a nurse too, but I know for a fact for a doctor, when a doctor doesn't want to see a patient or doesn't want to do a procedure. And so the senior doctor might turf a responsibility of taking care of a patient or doing a procedure to the more junior doctor, like the intern or the resident, and it's the senior resident or the fellow or the attending that's turfing it downhill to the lower ranking doctor. And that is a sure sign of selfishness, as opposed to the opposite of that would be okay, we're either going to do this together, or we're going to split the work, or we're going to split the procedures. In the ICU, we used to be okay, we got to put in 8 lines, and I'm going to put in 4, and my fellow or my resident is going to put in 4. We're going to split the work. Okay, so turfing. I also used to have a boss who used to give me a gazillion things to do. And then he's like, yeah, and you need to leave like early. You can't stay late. And then he would leave. And I'm like, well, shoot, yeah, you got to leave because you gave all this stuff to do to me. And now I've got to stay late to do all this stuff. No wonder you're leaving, okay? So next up, breaking their own rules at the organizational level is every company has values, right? And those values are things like integrity. Those values are things like teamwork. Those values are things like respect or respecting the individual. Okay, and then they have policies or they do things that are just not consistent with those values. So like one of my pet peeves around this is the entire concept of rapid resolution for health insurance problems. And so this is where a company might be like, well, we value teamwork or we value integrity. And then like if an employee has a problem with their health insurance, the HR department will be like, well, you just need to call customer service at the health insurance company. But if one of the executives has a problem, then that HR person takes that directly to the rapid resolutions team, which is like this secret back door within the account management of the insurance carrier to like quickly fix whatever problem that executive has so that they don't have to go through customer service, so that the executive never has to experience how truly bad the customer service is. Okay, how is that teamwork? How is that integrity? It's like the counter opposite of that. So like any CEO or executive that even asks for rapid resolution is breaking their own values. Any HR person that actually facilitates rapid resolution is breaking their own values. Oh, you got a problem? Well, use customer service. And if customer service isn't good enough for the CEO, then why in the world is it good enough for the rest of the employees? Okay, next up. They're inconsiderate. Okay, so this one, it's so funny because a lot of these things are nonverbal, and so you just have to pick them up with your eyes, not with your ears, okay? So I've been on like a tour of a workplace when I was interviewing or like going to visit a client site or whatever, and I would have like my boss or my potential boss, like when we walked down the hall, they like wouldn't wait for me. They'd be like bounding ahead, and they would like walk through the door and like just keep going, and like the door would close. I'm like, okay, so fine, you're like walking like 5, 6, 7 feet away ahead of me. And then 2, when you walk through the door, you're like not waiting for me to come through the door. Or like for other people, I might be like right next to that person and I'll wait and hold the door, but then this other person like keeps on going. Okay, so just, if they're just inconsiderate, like politeness is the grease that smooths the wheels of interaction. And if they just don't have the politeness, then they're obviously selfish. Okay, next up. How is that at the, what is being inconsiderate at the organizational level? It's being inconsiderate of lunch. To be like, okay, there's a time during the middle of the day where people get hungry and they will need to stop their work and consume food. And if there's complete disregard for lunch, then that is just an obvious sign of being inconsiderate. Okay, next up, the notorious weekend email. Okay, I have an issue. Like, unless like the company is literally on fire, do I really need to email you over the weekend? The answer is probably not. Okay, so don't do it. Okay, because it's inconsiderate, all right? So again, those are bright red flags about like selfishness within the organization. Okay, next up. Finally, we have being controlling. Well, how do you know if your boss is being controlling? They micromanage, but they micromanage after the fact. In other words, they give you some sort of assignment and then they play the game of like, guess what I'm thinking, and they don't give you very clear expectations up front. Listen, it's okay to give detailed expectations up front. I mean, shoot, when I was doing a procedure in the hospital, like the resident would have very clear, detailed expectations of like the way I would like, you know, scrub the patient's skin down and drape the patient and, you know, wash my hands and use, you know, double sterile gloves and sort of like that was very, but the point is that it was done through expectation setting beforehand, as opposed to being like, oh, just do this procedure and then I do it and then just browbeating me with criticisms for how I did it wrong. Okay, so that micromanagement after the fact is an indication of selfishness. Okay, next up, for the organization, being controlling is done through organizational manipulation. And typically at the organizational level, that manipulation takes the form of providing selective information. In other words, you as an employee in the company are expected to do certain things within your job, but you're not told the context of why you're doing this and how this relates to the company's overall mission. Now, let me give you a specific example of that. So PBMs are very selective in the information that they give to their employees. So their software programmers literally are not told why they're creating the software they're creating. They're not told anything around the context for the software or how it's used or how the pricing works. And I know this because they contact me. They're like, oh, at AHealthcareZ, you're like the first person to explain to me how this works. Like even my management at my own company, they don't explain this to me, okay? Because all they want you to do is to be quiet and keep your head down and do what they say because they're trying to manipulate you. They're being controlling. They're not trying to give you a full understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it, okay? So, why am I telling you this? Why are we discussing how to avoid selfish leaders? It's because there are a lot of people in healthcare who are early in their careers. And I wish I knew all this when I was early in my career. Because when you're early in your career, frequently you don't have the golden handcuffs. You don't have this financial responsibility, typically in the form of a mortgage and or of children, where a lot of times people are stuck. And they have to tolerate selfish bosses and they have to tolerate selfish organizations. And they're like, I can't leave because I need the money for my mortgage and for my kids. But oftentimes, if you're early in your career, you might not have a mortgage yet and you might not have kids yet. And you have a lot more flexibility. So please, if you are early in your career and you encounter selfish bosses and selfish organizations, then move. There has never been a better time to switch jobs. And the number one reason people don't do it is because of fear. Believe me, that fear can be overcome. You just need to have the courage to change, because if you do, believe me, your life will be so much better with a Philosopher King boss as opposed to a selfish boss. And that's my point for today. Thank you for watching AHealthcareZ.